Hello, everybody. Stoyan Yankov here, your podcast host, and I'm really, really excited about today's episode. First of all, I'm tuning in from a hotel room in Estonia. I just did a workshop yesterday for an organization called Technopol. Thank you so much, guys, for the fantastic experience. And John Paul gave me an opportunity, a time slot that I couldn't just say no. So I was like, I need to go with it. So thank you so much, John Paul. How are you this morning for you, I guess?
I'm doing great, Story, and I feel like, in fairness, I too should be at a hotel room. But unfortunately, fortunately for me, maybe unfortunately for you, I am at home. But at the very least, I'm delighted to join you from here in Chicago.
Thank you so much. We are so much looking forward to hear all the insights and wisdom. And those of you who are tuning in right now and did not read the description, I would like to just share with you a little bit about our guest today. John Paul Rollert teaches classes in leadership, ethics, and politics at Harvard University and the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. And his research focuses on intellectual history of capitalism, the ethics of leadership, and the application of empathy to law, business, and politics, something I'm really passionate about. Rollert has also been published in some of the most prestigious academic journals. He has worked with former President of the United States, Barack Obama, during his election campaigns in 2004, 2008, and 2012. He's also been frequently writing for some journals and publishing houses, you may say, journals like Bloomberg, the Washington Post, Fortune, and the New York Times. He's a graduate from Harvard College. He's earned his JD from Yale Law School and a PhD from the John U. Neff Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. He serves on the board of directors of two startups, Envel and Global Alumni. And these are just a few of my guests' accomplishments. He's also a very inspiring person who's all about leadership. So I'm so excited to welcome you today, John Paul.
Well, Story, it's such a pleasure to be here with you. And after that introduction, I can guarantee you the check is in the mail. So thank you so much for having me.
Very excited, as I said. And let's start with a little bit of a question to kind of break the ice. If you can share with the audience just one story from your early years that can give them a good sense about who you are as a person, what would be that story?
Yeah, for me, if there's one story that probably maybe gives you a sense of who I am, it's that when I was a child, I grew up in the city of Chicago, the third largest city in the United States, in a very kind of urban cosmopolitan area. And when I was about 12 and a half years old, my parents decided to move the family to our family farm in Michigan, apple farm that has actually been in the family for about 160 years now, maybe a little bit longer even. And of course, if you've grown up in a cosmopolitan urban center and you suddenly find yourself thrust into the countryside, it is quite a change when you are going into seventh grade. But one of the things that change taught me, and it's a topic we're going to talk about a little bit here today, is the importance of empathy. When you live in a world where you kind of expect that everyone will think the same way you think or have the same kind of worldview or the same sets of experiences, you don't really have a need for empathy because everyone is thinking roughly in the same way. But when you find yourself moving from one place to another, and that second place is quite different from the first, different in terms of sensibilities and experience and the people that you meet, it kind of compels you to develop that capacity for empathy. It's something I certainly had to do going into my seventh grade and now being in a very different environment. And it's a lesson that I took from that experience and one that certainly has shaped my life, my ethics, who I am as a person, but also my academic research as well, and the ways in which I think about leadership.
We're certainly going to touch upon the topic of empathy, the topic of care and compassion, something I'm also deeply passionate about. And I want to start this conversation with asking you this question. You're teaching leadership, but what is your definition of leadership?
Well, if I were to give a pithy definition of leadership, I would say that leadership is an art, not a science. And what I mean by that is that when you think about cultivating the capacity for leadership, you don't want to think of it in terms of one might think of, say, physics or mathematics, but more in terms of a craft that you have to apply yourself to. that you learn very much by doing. At the very beginning of the leadership classes I teach at Harvard, I will often use the analogy of riding a bike. Not far from where I live here in Chicago, my father took me out to teach me how to ride a bike, probably when I was 5 years old. And I learned how to ride a bike in the way in which most people learn how to ride a bike, which is after the training wheels are off on a part of kind of the lawn that looked especially comfortable. My father ran along holding the bike, and then he let it go. And I began pedaling. And of course, what happened is what always happens when you learn how to ride a bike, you fall. And I fell several times, I know, right in the park where that happened. But I learned ultimately by doing. And the reason I stress that is in part that if I said to you, Stoyan, I hear you want to learn how to ride a bike. Here's a book you should read, and that will teach you how to ride a bike. It seems a little bit ridiculous to think of it in that way. This is not to say that if you want to be a master cyclist, there maybe aren't things you could potentially learn from a book. But like so many kind of craft forms, the only way in which you're going to learn how to ride a bike is to get on the bike and start pedaling. Leadership, I think, is exactly the same way. There are a lot of lessons that we can take. There are a lot of books that we can read that are helpful. There are wonderful podcasts like yours that we can listen to. But at the end of the day, you're only going to learn by doing. And so, therefore, leadership is not necessarily a science, but really it's more of an art or a craft.
I'm so happy to hear that from somebody who's teaching leadership, that we should be actually focusing a lot more on the experience. But beyond teaching, you've also been supporting the campaigns of Barack Obama and actually observing firsthand one exceptional leader, in my own view. What what have you learned by being around Barack Obama and his team? Maybe some, if you can share some lessons that are not so obvious, something that you don't see on CNN and the news, but some of these leadership lessons that were very fascinating for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, by way of background, when I was a graduate student starting off doing my PhD at the University of Chicago in the fall of 2002, actually one of the first experiences I had at a welcome ceremony for the graduates was to meet then state senator and law lecturer Barack Obama. I often joke that I met him the way most of us met Barack Obama, which is to say on television. In this case, I was in an overflow room because I couldn't get into the main hall. And so here on this kind of open access channel appeared this kind of young, dashing, handsome, incredibly elegant law lecturer, Barack Obama. I was immediately kind of entranced by this remarkable individual. And at the end of his talk, he said, if you're interested in law, politics, or Chicago, get in touch. And I was interested in all three. So I reached out and ultimately found my way into helping out on his 2004 campaign while still a graduate student, doing work in their press shop. And then I went off to law school. And you mentioned earlier at Yale Law School. And when Barack Obama was actually going to run for president, I decided to come back to Chicago to leave law school for a year and work for about a year and a half on his 2008 campaign. And then when he ran for reelection again, I was living in Chicago at the time. The headquarters was right downtown. So I worked again on his reelect in 2012. And so obviously I had a long opportunity to kind of study Barack Obama somewhat at a distance, but over a fairly long period of time. And there are a few things that that experience taught me. There are lessons that I try to communicate in my leadership classes at Harvard. The first is that leadership is very much a kind of visceral affair. The connection between leaders and followers is kind of largely passional by nature as opposed to rational. And of course, I think we're all too familiar with some of the downsides of that. It isn't to say that you don't need to vindicate yourself rationally to your followers, but when you're understanding that kind of immediate relationship, it's deeply emotional by nature. And one of the reasons it's emotional, and I would say this is the second lesson I learned from Barack Obama, is that people come to invest in an image of you. They come to admire you. They see in you something that they, by virtue of following in you, invest in you. And they invest in a very straightforward way in terms of time. If you think about the people that we admire, the people we put our time, effort, and care into, the leaders that we look to, we are investing our own time and our emotions into them. And so, insofar as there is that emotional, passional connection, they are investing in an image of you as a leader. And that in turn kind of leads to a third lesson, a lesson of kind of, I think, often self protection as a leader. to the degree that others are investing in an image of you, you have to also work to conserve that sense of self. We all have a kind of variety about our behavior. We act in slightly different ways at different moments, and that's not because we're hypocritical or because we're fakes. It's because different moments demand different behavior. The way in which you may act with your mother or father or your grandparents will be different from the way in which you act with a professor or a boss or your best friend or your spouse. There is always that variety. But insofar as you're a leader, there's a particular kind of pretty set image that people are investing in. And insofar as, your private life and your public self may be somewhat different, you have to find ways to kind of have that public self, that self consistent with strong leadership, but also find ways to conserve that sense of self that might be more consistent with your private life. When I got to know Barack Obama, he wasn't someone particularly famous or well known. And I think watching him become this leader that was not just someone known by a few people in Chicago, but known globally, I watched someone who is kind of struggling with maintaining that sense of self while becoming that global leader and doing so at an age that frankly is not different from my own age right now. He was someone who was in his 40s as opposed to his teens or his 20s. And so watching that up close to me was very illustrative for some of the challenges of leadership, but also some of the opportunities as well.
I'm actually very curious to ask you, what was he like out of the light of the projectors? Do you see the same type of personality, or was he creating a character, this charming character that will inspire crowds and the nation and the world? Was he, maybe can you share something, behind the scenes? Look at, was he doubting himself? Did he have insecurities? Just how was he like?
Well, the anecdote that I quite love, and it's not mine, it's someone who worked much more closely and intimately with him, one of our economic advisors on the 2008 campaign. When he was a guest in my class a few years later, I won't use his name to kind of keep his privacy. He shared this anecdote. He was also a professor at the University of Chicago. And he shared this anecdote that in getting to know Barack Obama, he always thought of him as being something like a member of the faculty. And he meant that in a couple of ways. On the one hand, Barack Obama by nature, and I think we all tend to see this, is a very cerebral person. Ideas matter to him. He likes arguing about ideas. He's a highly rational individual. If you can make the best argument, you can succeed with him. But the other end of that was to suggest that he was not necessarily this almost overwhelmingly charismatic figure when you're in his presence. Bill Clinton is often described in this fashion as someone who is as charismatic when you're standing right next to him as he is in a crowd of 20,000 people giving a speech. Barack Obama, especially I think when you're engaging him one on one or in small groups, is a much more cerebral individual, much more like someone you would find at the faculty lounge than necessarily before a large crowd. And I think to a certain extent, a lot of us who are around him really admired him for that, in part because what it spoke to is the sense that even though he was this tremendously compelling figure when he was on stage, when you were behind the scenes with him and interacting with him, he took the ideas and the proposals very seriously. I think he combined, in many respects, the best of charismatic and technocratic leadership. So you weren't simply giving the mantle of leadership over to someone who was tremendously compelling on screen or when giving a speech, but someone who also took very seriously the responsibilities of leadership and ultimately coming to the best conclusions and thinking about what was best for the country. And to me, that balance is a tough one to strike. Very few leaders do strike it. And it's something that I've always admired about Barack Obama.
Thank you so much for giving us a behind the scenes look at some leader that many of us really look after, and one of the most charismatic speakers as well. And I think it's about time we start kind of unveiling the topic of today, the $1 million question, or with the inflation, maybe $1.5 million question. Are leaders born, or are they created? And maybe to start unveiling, we can start with do we all have the same capacity to be leaders in your perspective, or you have a different opinion on that?
Well, to me, that's a great question. And boy, I hope leaders can be made because otherwise my career as a teacher might come to an end very quickly. I mean, I will say, Stoyan, and it's not going to come as any surprise that this is a question that is often asked of me by students when they take my leadership classes. I anticipate that when I start teaching at Harvard here in just a couple of weeks, this is one of the first questions I will get on the first day of class. And here's the way that I describe it. When I was in high school, I loved playing basketball. As I mentioned earlier, I grew up in Chicago. It was the era of Michael Jordan. There was no cooler sport to play than basketball. So I spent a lot of time playing basketball throughout grade school and into high school. And I loved playing basketball. I have not played basketball in any meaningful way for far longer now than I care to think. So if I went out to the basketball court and tried to play a pickup game, my skills would not be so great. They'd be rather shabby. But I think that you would agree that if I spent the next 365 days practicing on the basketball court, taking jump shots, running drills, at the end of that year, I would be a much better basketball player a year from now than I am today. Practice makes perfect, is a saying that we'll often say here in the United States. But the corollary to that, in the analogy that I'm giving, is practice doesn't make you LeBron James or Michael Jordan. There's no amount of practicing I could do that would ever get me to that point. And so, what I tell students is certainly there are certain qualities that we are born with that perhaps make us more or less naturally disposed toward leadership. But rather than focusing on those, instead, you should focus on what's within your power to kind of shape, create, and improve upon. You need to go out to that proverbial basketball court, take those jump shots, run those drills, and focus on improving yourself in a deep and meaningful way. And the question for me, if I were to go to the basketball court, is not within a year whether I would be as good as Michael Jordan or LeBron James. I'll give you the answer. The answer is no, not by a long shot. But the question is whether I, with my capacity for playing basketball well, would I have maximized that capacity? Leadership is no different. If you're thinking about your own personal capacity for leadership, you shouldn't be comparing yourself necessarily to the greatest leaders in history. You should be assessing your own personal capacity for leadership and thinking about what is the basketball court I need to go out to in order to refine my own skills. So while it is true, again, there are some qualities we're maybe gifted with at birth that make us more or less disposed toward leadership. Rather than focusing on those, we have to focus on the qualities that are within our power, those that we can refine and improve upon, and kind of go to the extreme in our own personal capacity for leadership at that extreme. At our extreme, are we in the same capacity again as a Michael Jordan? No, but the point is to get to kind of our best self rather than the self of someone else.
And I'm wondering, how much do you think self-awareness is important, especially when it comes to the educational context? Um, I have no idea how it is right now these days in university, but when I was studying in high school, in university, I don't recall having a class on self awareness where I get to understand and learn what are my talents, and maybe if I'm not a Michael Jordan material or a professional basketball material, to kind of let it go and decide, you know what, I need to focus on what I'm really good at. And
Mhm.
on top of that, not just what I'm good at, but to see myself as the package of all the assets, my strengths, my passions, my network, all the things that give me an edge. And then I can focus on that instead of trying to be something that I don't have the capacity for. So I'm actually curious to hear, you interact with many students these days. How important is self-awareness, and what can we do better to support young and older leaders to be more self-aware?
So I think that's a great question. You know, when you teach a leadership class, part and parcel of the experience is you're going to have a lot of students who are have a very strong and maybe sometimes overinflated sense of self. They come in not just ambitious, but maybe a little bit arrogant. And the first thing I tell them, or one of the first things I tell them, is that the very fact that you have a desire for leadership in your imagination, a vision of your leadership in your imagination, is kind of it's a psychological artifact. And frankly, it isn't that interesting, right? The craft of leadership is how do you bring that which is in your imagination, right? That vision you have, how do you bring it out into the world? If it merely exists in your imagination, it isn't real because you're not demonstrating it. And so when you go out and you kind of conduct yourself with leadership for the first time, and you have too strong a sense of self, you're too full of yourself, we might say, what tends to happen is that you are not looking for the reaction shots from other people, right? You're not assessing how they're ultimately viewing you. And at an extreme, if you are absolutely almost kind of delusionally self confident, no reaction shots, no reactions from others are ever going to confirm or deny for you your own greatness because you're already convinced of it in your own imagination. And therefore, when you're entirely delusional, there's no ability to get this kind of feedback that you're describing. And if you can't get that feedback, you have no sense of self awareness because the sense of self awareness is key to understanding how others view you. And as I suggest in my classes, part of the leadership path is figuring out how others view you. To what degree is it consistent with this vision of leadership that you have? And insofar as you're not succeeding, how can you work on that to improve your skills of leadership? Now, what does this all involve? Well, for me at least, it involves a capacity for empathy. The more that you can kind of stand outside yourself and view yourself the way others view you, the better you can figure out what are in fact my strengths as opposed to what I wish my strengths were and what are my weaknesses. And I tell students this is a very difficult experience, in part because if leadership is a craft, like any craft or any exercise you're engaged in, like learning to ride a bike, you're going to fall disproportionately or you're going to fail early on. And if you're not prepared to learn from those failures, because they tend to be very personal, your failures are other people reflecting on you and your shortcomings. And that's very painful. We all like to think that we are great and wonderful, choose your superlative. But to the degree that we do not succeed in the way we would like to succeed, we have to do a very public and personal self assessment. And sometimes that can lead to us running home and crawling under our beds and giving up leadership altogether. And that's okay. Leadership is not necessarily for everyone. There are a lot of people who are, I would say, a little bit more introverted by nature and not as comfortable engaging people in this very public way, or are much happier at a spreadsheet or before their computer. And that's wonderful. But if you're going to be successful in this very public activity that is leadership, at some point you have to kind of come out from under your bed, go back onto the public square and try again and try to find a way to kind of fix and improve upon what you did earlier. The example I will often give my students is that when you do a public speaking class, typically one of the first things that they will do is they will ask you to give a speech and they will videotape you. And the reason they do that is because after you've given the speech, they will sit you down and you will have that harrowing experience of watching yourself give a speech. And almost without exception, perhaps unless you're entirely delusional, the speech that you will give will not live up to your kind of best sense of self that you have in your imagination. And what you'll learn is you have to work on that and do much better. But what I'm describing in this case is an example of almost forcing you to watch yourself, right? And to kind of either, be empathetic toward what you've done or kind of restrain that empathy. We can't always do that. People are not always necessarily following us, and thank goodness for that, with video cameras so that we can watch ultimately our behavior. And so by cultivating that capacity for empathy, of standing outside of ourselves, watching the way we kind of work and go about doing things, if we do that successfully, we're going to develop that sense of self-awareness. And I think, like you, Stoyan, I think that sense of self-awareness is indispensable to empathy and leadership as well, too. And it's something that you have to cultivate with time and care, understanding that part of a sense of self-awareness is learning where you're failing, right? And being willing to confront those failures and work on them and to kind of change yourself from the inside out.
And then you actually become a much better leader because you're able to accept your shortcomings together with your strengths. It is very interesting, John Paul. I'm here in Estonia. You might have heard Estonia is this very small country with more than 10 unicorn companies. They love to say that it's the country with the most unicorn companies per capita. um, so,
It's
so I
a
don't
good
know.
accomplishment, a good marker of success.
They're doing a lot of amazing things when it comes to tech and innovation. But the interesting thing is, whoever you talk to, and I do a lot of coaching and mentoring young entrepreneurs, sometimes they're students aspiring to be entrepreneurs, and you ask them, so what do you aspire to be? Where do you want to be? and 90% will say, I want to build a unicorn. And I'm like, wait a second. I asked you, where do you want to be 3 years from now? You just have an idea about a project, and your vision is that in 3 years you're going to be running a unicorn company. And it just makes me think, what is the kind of expectations we set to these young people? And I really hope those who are listening, who are in this kind of age group, to really take a step back and reassess, do you want to build a unicorn? Do you want to be an entrepreneur and a leader? Do you want to be a executive? Maybe you're actually a great head of department, or maybe you're actually a great IT person. I don't know. You don't have to be the front guy necessarily, because it comes with a price, right? Leadership, and I would love to hear your take on that. Like leadership comes with a price, according to me. It gives you a lot of perks, right? Because you are the first person to go out there, in the perspective of public speaking, right? You're the lights of the projectors, but it also comes with the responsibility. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, so and I could not agree with you more. There's a point in the class, probably around the fourth or fifth session, where I will almost inevitably have typically a younger student, someone who is in his or her early 20s, come up to me, and they'll say to me, boy, this is a lot less romantic and exciting than I imagined it to be. This is difficult. And I said, well, yeah, you're now not focused on the achievement, right? Having the unicorn or being in the spotlight. You're focused on the work that it takes to get you there and the trade-offs that are implicit. It's like dreaming about being an NBA all-star but never going to the basketball court. You haven't really begun to wrestle with the kind of work that goes into even having a shot at success. So, on the one hand, kind of using more of that imaginative power to think through what it actually means to be a leader and to put yourself to work therein and begin developing the self-awareness we've already talked about. But the other side of it is really figuring out if this is precisely what you want to do. One of the biggest trade-offs with leadership is again this sense that your sense of self becomes somewhat restrained. There's a way in which people view you, and you are kind of boxed in some respects, and also kind of the wider variety of your behavior kind of has to be restrained in some ways. Very few of us are comfortable with the idea that we are always being watched and taken account of. But the more successful you become, the more that's your fate. You're no longer an anonymous person. When I first met or came into contact with Barack Obama in the fall of 2002, he was basically an anonymous person. Almost no one knew him. And within a few years, he could no longer and go to the supermarket and shop for goods without everybody wanting his time and attention. And of course, just a couple of years after that, he couldn't even do that because of safety considerations. Now, obviously, that's an extreme. But I think what it brings home is this idea is that the more successful you are, the more your kind of leadership achievement is obvious in public, the more attention that you get, the more confined your world tends to be. And there are certainly trade offs within that. So, on the one hand, it's a tremendous amount of work just to get to that achievement in the first place. And then there are kind of behavioral and social trade offs you attain once you get there. And for a lot of people, and I can see this in my class, coming to the conclusion that this is not the world for you is, I think, a very powerful achievement and one that I encourage within my own students. I think part of a leadership class is not just giving an honest perspective on leadership, but helping students to figure out for themselves if this is really the life for them. It's one thing to say, I would like to learn how to ride a bike. It's another thing to say, I would like to win the Tour de France. I am delighted to know how to ride a bike. I like bike riding, but I would have no interest in the kind of commitment that would go into being successful in the Tour de France. And I have great admiration for those who do. But that's because, in part, I haven't just dreamed of that accomplishment. I have a sense of what goes into it. And the more I think you give people that sense, the more they can really evaluate whether leadership is actually for them.
It's really interesting. One of the first guests we had on the podcast is Simon Hodges. He's a he's a coach, and he's specifically focused on coaching ultra high net individuals, billionaires, and their families. And we had this discussion, and I was like, what is it like to be around these people? And he was like, you got to know that these are people who are exceptionally good in something. They're genius and they are fully committed in one, two, three things max, which led them, this commitment, this discipline, led them to achieve what they have achieved. But the price they had to pay, the sacrifice, the you mentioned the example with Barack Obama. He can go to the shop. Now he cannot go anywhere without being noticed. I remember also the Netflix series about Chicago Bulls, right? The Last Dance. All these scenes of Michael Jordan. He can't leave the hotel room. That's it. Like all the price that you have to pay to like, and in a business context, like we're going to the extremes, but again, you are a CEO of a large organization. It's not just you show up at conferences and you know, like you're a decision maker. There's a lot of responsibility on your shoulders from all the different directions. So yes, you maybe get a good salary, maybe you have power, but you also have a lot of responsibility. So those of you who are listening, we're just talking here with John Paul, and hopefully we can inspire you to at least put a thought and think about who do I want to be? Do I want to be a leader, or am I okay actually to have a calmer and easier existence at that stage in my life? But since a couple of times you already mentioned empathy, John Paul, and it's something I'm very passionate about. Let's talk about empathy and leadership. Is that just the right thing to do, or is empathy actually a strategy that can turn to be commercially successful as well?
That's I think, a very important question. Now, obviously, as a moral matter, I think empathy is the right kind of behavior for one who's in a leadership position. But I also agree, I think it's tremendously advantageous. Well, why so? I often tell my students that essential to the art of leadership is the ability to build successful, strong teams. I mean, you're not a leader if you don't have a team, right? You can't be Robinson Crusoe alone on his desert island is not a leader of anyone, right? Maybe, I guess, the animals, perhaps. But, we judge leadership by the way in which people are able to gather others around them and inspire them and get them to do great things, which means that so much of leadership is, again, this people focused art. To the degree that you are empathetic, I think you're able to connect with people, you're able to build great teams, and you're able to attract the kind of talent, which certainly in the private sector is essential to building a dynamic business. So, on the one hand, internal to a company, having that strong sense of empathy, I think, is absolutely essential in order to build those strong, dynamic, cohesive teams. If you can't convince people to kind of work with you and work for you, you're never going to be able to build a good team in the first place. And I tend to think that empathy is an indispensable asset to connecting with people, to understanding their needs, and to connecting your needs or the needs of the company to their needs successfully. Now, the flip side of that also are your customers that you have. To the degree that you understand the needs of your customers, you can connect with them, you can anticipate their wants and desires, you can troubleshoot their needs. The more capably you're able to do that, the more successful you'll ultimately be as a leader as well too, within kind of the commercial sector. Customers are human beings as well too, and the kinds of traits and tools that we use to connect well with our employees and our customers are not altogether different. So I think having that capacity for empathy is highly beneficial if you are kind of thinking about building a team within your company, but also connecting with those customers who become partners outside of the company over the long term. Empathy will benefit you in both ways. And that's why I tend to think for leaders, it's an indispensable asset.
And could you, I'm sure you are exploring a lot of cases and examples with your students and beyond. Could you maybe share, if you can think of an example, a case of organization or a leader that is exceptionally good in practicing empathy and empower empathy at the workplace?
Well, let me give a kind of broader example. Let me actually give a workplace example that I think will be helpful. And I was thinking about this question a little bit this morning. And I think I'm actually myself lucky enough to work in a very large institution that, institutionally speaking, as a matter of corporate culture, does this quite well. And that is, the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. And I think there are probably three qualities that I would emphasize as I think about the culture there. One is that I would say that it's a culture that invests in people, right? And there are two kinds of investments. We often think of the hard financial investments, and those are certainly important. People have to feel like they're rewarded. If they do good work, they are taken care of. But the more interesting investment is the investment of time and energy. If you're only paying your people well, but you're not investing time and energy, you're probably going to have to overpay them to keep them. But to the degree that you invest time, energy, and care in others, those investments pay out in, I think, a kind of strong corporate culture. And certainly at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, I think we do a wonderful job of investing in people at all levels, administrators, faculty, and students. And I think that's central to part of our success. Now, connected to that, I think there are two other qualities that I see at the business school that I would emphasize as well too. And they're kind of related in some ways. The first is kind of developing a culture of respect. And I think a culture of respect is important in part because a lot of people are engaged in different types of activities that often that you don't fully understand. And a culture of respect demands on you that when you're engaging someone else, you make an honest effort to really understand where they're coming from, understand the work they're doing, understand how you may actually view things differently. And again, that takes time, patience, empathy, and care. And all of that feeds into this sense of a culture of respect. But the nice thing about a culture of respect is that when it's built, you have a great deal of goodwill. And that goodwill is important for many reasons, but also in part because it liberates people to kind of pursue their own ideas and to have the good kind of positive disagreements that are necessary to get to the right course of action. If you don't have a culture of respect and you have a culture of distrust, people don't trust each other enough to kind of be free to pursue their own ideas. There's a lot of recrimination, there's a lot of paranoia and doubtfulness. And so the more that you build that culture of respect and mutual respect, the more you create those opportunities for free inquiry and freely pursuing ideas that are essential to any kind of institution thriving. I think the University of Chicago does all three of these things well. It invests in people, in the business school in particular. It invests in all sorts of people. It builds that culture of mutual respect. And what I think that ultimately allows for is this opportunity for free inquiry and the pursuit of ideas, which are essential to kind of making the best decisions, forming the best plans. And in my experience, I feel like I'm lucky enough to work for an institution that does that well. And to me, other institutions that do that tend to thrive far more than institutions that don't have a culture of respect, that don't liberate people to pursue ideas, and then ultimately don't invest in people around them, or only think of investment in terms of money as opposed to terms of time and interest and professional advancement. You have to do all of those types of investments to get the project rolling.
I recently did a workshop in a quite a large organization, and the main topic of the workshop was personal and team productivity. I'm very passionate about this subject as well. So we do the workshop. I share some practical examples how to set goals, align on priorities. We align on frequency of how often they should have weekly meetings. Very practical, right? Um, and one lady is raising her hand, and I'm like, "Yes, please. Excuse me. I love all these tools, but can I have a meeting with my team on Friday in which we don't talk about the business, we don't talk about the goals, we're just being human?" She's asking me. I'm a trainer, external consultant, right? And I'm like, "That's interesting. Can you share more about it?" Now she starts talking. We don't have time. We want to be human first, but we are so busy. We have so many deadlines. We don't have time to just to share a few words to hear how's the family of this person going. We're always rushing around. And I'm like, is anybody else feeling the same way? The whole room, 95%. Then everybody started sharing. But then again, this was a group of mid-level managers. And here's the thing, as you said, the leadership in organization you belong to, the top level leadership decided that that's a priority to create a culture of respect and focus on people. What if you're a mid-level manager? What can you do to inspire such transformation, John Paul?
I mean, it's a real challenge, but I think that you always have to look for what's immediately within your power and your scope, right? If you're part of a large corporation and you're a middle manager, there's not much you're going to be able to do to influence decisions at the very top. But you're going to have a lot of people around you. You're going to have a lot of executive authority within your own job. And you have to be responsible for that immediate culture because it's really the only thing you can be responsible for. And I think, building a culture of care, right, which is I know something that you're passionate about, is really important. And I think you actually highlighted in that anecdote one of the ways that you do that. What I will often describe, especially in my leadership classes, as unstructured time, right, is kind of building into the experience of students the opportunity to really connect. Because if you haven't connected, you haven't built up the trust that is essential for goodwill. And so therefore your work may be cold, it may be more mechanical, it may seem almost mercenary in nature. But I often tell my teaching assistants when we're leading a class at the very end of the first class, if I see students lingering and talking to one another after class, they can go, but they've decided they want to connect, they want to spend time meeting each other. I know that we've already succeeded in a small way. Doesn't mean I don't have to teach all of my lessons and communicate these ideas, but what I have is the right kind of mindset, the right temperament or aptitude that is necessary to get the class moving in the right direction. And you can only do that by giving people the opportunity to connect as human beings as opposed to as professionals or students. And you can't force people to do that, but you can create the opportunities for that. And I think that when you do that, you begin creating a culture where people want to be part of the organization they're with. If people are only part of your organization because they're looking for a paycheck, you may get the job done, but you'll be highly inefficient and no one will enjoy themselves. And the more that you're creating a culture where people love to show up to work, to participate, they feel validated, they're enjoying themselves, it's not just the case that the work will be better, but the work will also be cheaper and more efficient. So there are many good reasons you want to aim for creating precisely that kind of culture.
And I'm sure there's many leaders listening to this podcast right now who most of them want to do good. But let's address the top level leadership. Um, Imagine somebody's listening right now, which maybe for one reason or another focused a little bit more on the efficiency, on results, or getting things done. Um, but now they listen to this podcast and it's like, oh, I need to care more for my people. I need to start creating this culture. So where do I start? Right? So could you maybe share some ideas, suggestions, practical advice on where could somebody start to inspire such a culture?
Yeah, well, let me emphasize two things. One, a little more practical, and almost one more a matter of sentiment. The more practical of the two is you actually have to provide time. If you are focused so much on efficiency that you exclude all kind of free, flexible time, your people just simply won't connect, right? Again, going back to the anecdote that you shared, this woman put up her hand and said, well, maybe can we find a time for us to connect in this unstructured fashion? If you're unwilling to prioritize that, you're not going to accomplish the tasks that you're describing, Stoyan. It's simply part of the equation. So you have to find a way to build that in. But that means you have to be willing to allocate time. And of course, when you're a successful individual, time is the most precious thing you have. But I think rather than thinking of this as a way of wasting time or something that is optional but not necessary, you should think of it as being absolutely necessary. Because the only way you're going to build a strong dynamic team is by willingness to allocate this. And as we all know, the hardest thing to build are great teams. And boy, once you've built them, the investment is tremendous. And if that merely means you allocate a little bit of time to keep that team strong, it's the best investment you can end up making. The sentimental one is the way you kind of conduct yourself, and it's a hard one. I will often say in my leadership classes that I tend to think the most undervalued virtue in leadership is patience. Why? Because patience is difficult. We're all overstretched, our schedules are too full, and the more successful you are, the more people are making demands of you. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be kind of careful with the way in which you allocate your time, but patience is more a matter of how we engage other people. When we say that we've dealt with someone impatiently, we know that we haven't put forward kind of our best self. We haven't treated them in the way that is ultimately kind of indicative of, morally speaking, the type of life we look to lead. And when you treat people with patience, and you allocate the time necessary for patience, you're signaling respect. And there's an old saying that the fish rots from the head down when it comes to kind of CEOs, but the converse is true as well. If you are a CEO or the leader of any kind of team and you're treating others with patience, if you're showing other people it's good enough for you to allocate time, patience, and care, it's going to be good enough for anybody else on the team. And if you're showing that you don't have to allocate that, no one else will either. And so building in kind of time into your schedules in a practical way and complementing that with patience, I think, again, morally speaking, it's not just something that I think redounds to your credit and benefits your team as a moral matter, but it's also in terms of the ultimate efficacy of your team and your ability to keep it together. I think it's essential as well, too.
And since you mentioned morally a number of times, and I read that you have been studying quite closely Adam Smith, and I'm just wondering, where is this passion and interest coming from, and what excites you about it? What is something that we can maybe apply to leadership in today's business world?
Well, I first had a chance to read about Adam Smith when I was a sophomore in college. And the way his work was presented was really fascinating to me. Now, most people, if they've ever heard the name Adam Smith, they think of him as kind of the godfather of modern free market economics, most famously in his book, The Wealth of Nations. That tends to be the work that everyone's familiar with. But in this class, we were introduced not only to that book, but to another, Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. Actually, the first of the two books that he wrote, the one that he thought was the greater of the two. History, I think, disagreed a little bit. But I tend to think books that are entirely complementary. If The Wealth of Nations teaches you essentially how to make money, I would say the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and I'm being a little glib here, the Theory of Moral Sentiments teaches you how to make money in a moral fashion and ultimately how to spend it well and to kind of consider the degree to which that kind of success is ultimately valuable in your life. If the motive force of The Wealth of Nations is a sense of self interest, the mainspring of the Theory of Moral Sentiments is a capacity for empathy. And so I think marrying these different qualities helps you as an ambitious individual, whether you're ambitious in yourself or you're putting together a company that has ambitious goals, to do so in a way that is not only, I think, efficient and successful, but also has a kind of strong moral imprint on the world. And that kind of variety of thinking is something that I deeply admire. It's certainly something I try to bring into my classes where I use Adam Smith's text in order to kind of inform my own teaching. And so, therefore, he's something of an intellectual hero to me. But he's someone who I also think is relevant within this present day as well, too.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm excited right now to read both works of Adam Smith. Hopefully, the listeners can also get a copy and see if there's something that resonates with them the way it does to you. And John Paul, since we met for the first time last year in Graz at 15 Seconds Festival, fantastic conference. Which, by the way, I'm flying to Graz tomorrow for the this year's edition of 15 Seconds. And interestingly enough, I will be moderating a panel about the future of work. And the main topic we're going to explore is the future of work more human? And I want to put into the equation and the context the whole dynamics globally, all the events and circumstances in the past couple of years, global pandemic, there's a war in Ukraine, inflation. Many people talk about upcoming recession. So, is the future of work more human? And what should we do ourselves with as leaders in order to be able to address the challenges ahead of us?
Yeah, I mean, let me try to offer an optimistic note and suggest why I think the future of work could and should be more human. Throughout so much of human history, and still the case today, human beings have to confront lives with real drudgery and toil. right? Working often in kind of manufacturing situations, or as a farmer, say in the medieval times, it was incredibly hard work, physically demanding without a lot of benefits. Today, we are able to achieve kind of efficiency and gains that are just extraordinary. And we live lives that our great, 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 great grandparents just couldn't imagine in terms of the luxury and ease and comfort. And yet, at the same time, in many respects, our work in different ways also seems somewhat inhuman, no matter where you are on the socioeconomic spectrum. And I think the one hope that I have is that as we kind of move into a century where the world will only continue to kind of grow in efficiency and productivity and wealth, that we find ways to allocate those benefits to make life a little bit more humane, and our work a little bit more humane as well too. If we have failed to do that, if by the end of the 21st century life seems as filled with a kind of techno drudgery as it did a kind of physical drudgery 500 years ago, as a species, we will have failed. And my hope is that increasingly young people will learn how that we can better prioritize and use again these efficiencies, this efficiency gains that we've had, and the wealth that we've created to make life more humane for people, to make work more meaningful and enjoyable, as opposed to a different kind of drudgery, a drudgery that may be more mental and psychological as opposed to physical, but is drudgery nonetheless.
And in that regard, we both like reading books. What would be the first three books that come to mind that could be relevant? They don't have to be written in 2022, but could be relevant in 2022 when it comes to leadership.
Well, let me give three books that I actually use in two different leadership classes I teach. They are older books, but I think they continue to be incredibly relevant. One I've already mentioned is Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. It's a very challenging book, but it's a good kind of challenge. And I think that insofar as it draws this connection between empathy and ethics and what are the demands of empathy, I think that especially in a world where we think probably too often of self-interest, it's a good complement to the way in which we think about our life and our work. So that's a book that has been indispensable for me, and it's one that I ask students in both my ethics and leadership classes to read. Two other books that I use in a leadership and politics class I teach during January's at Harvard. One is a book from the 1960s called Daniel Boorstin's The Image. And it's a book that thinks a lot about the ways in which we think about news and information and what makes for an event, and the ways in which we often will bring in PR and media in order to kind of create moments of interest. And there are certainly benefits to that if you are thinking about the way in which you present yourself and create those moments of interest, but there are moral drawbacks as well too. Certainly in the United States, we've all watched CNN, Fox News, MSNBC constantly running banners that say breaking news. And so rarely does it seem like the news is breaking. It seems more like they want to pique our attention. And when you do that too much, it tends to wear people out. I think this book is great insofar as it gives you a better sense of how kind of the news works and certain lessons that you can incorporate, I'd say, in an offensive way in your own personal life, things that you can do, but in a defensive way, insofar as you're aware of the way in which often we're manipulated by news. A book of a similar vein is from a gentleman by the name of Walter Lippmann. The book is Public Opinion. It's actually written almost a century ago. And what Walter Lippmann is thinking about are the same set of issues around questions around media and messaging and questions of public opinion broadly, and the way in which governments tend to shape those matters with an eye toward conveying ideas. And again, I think that it's a book where you can take some of those lessons about the way in which we kind of create common sense or public opinion, and you can integrate that into the way in which you lead your own business and your own life, kind of refining your communication, so to speak. But as a defensive matter, it also makes you more aware in the way in which people will often attempt to kind of manipulate you institutionally or perhaps with governments. And making you more aware of such matters makes you better able to kind of anticipate them and deal with them, which I think leads to kind of clearer thought and ultimately better plans and purpose. So all three of those books, for me, books I use in my classes, are books that I go back to time and again for lessons. They're challenging, but sometimes you have to climb the mountainside to get to the summit and see the view, and the view is worth it.
And thank you so much for sharing these recommendations. I'm happy I asked you this question, and it's not the 2022 super hot trendy book, but you actually gave us some works that could be relevant not just in 2022 but for the centuries to come, so to say. So I'm definitely gonna check them out. And since this podcast is called Productivity Mastery, I want to know about yourself, John Paul. What makes a day of the life of John Paul makes you feel productive?
So the most important resource for me, and I say it's so important because it was not something I drew upon in my teens and early 20s, is getting a good night's sleep. For some strange reason, maybe about 20 years ago, people began to fetishize sleeplessness. I think that's beginning to change. And I probably did it a little bit as well too. Now, part of that is there are only so many hours in the day. You're trying to cram in as much as you can. But I tend to think fetishizing sleeplessness is almost like fetishizing holding your breath. If you hold your breath too long, you start killing brain cells, and going sleepless does the same thing. And especially insofar as, on the one hand, a lot of the work that you do is really thoughtful. It requires time, attention, and care. You need to have that sleep. And on the other hand, insofar as you are dealing with people and you want to be patient, sleep is an indispensable asset. I know that when I go without sleep, I am a far less pleasant person to interact with, in part because I'm a human being. And we're all not that distant from the baby who has gone without sleep and begins crying and breaking down. Now, rarely will I say I get to that point. But certainly when I've gone without sleep, I'm just less pleasant to deal with because my own sense of patience and self reserve and self awareness has gone down. And I become that kind of primitive being who's just frustrated. And so I tend to think that getting sleep is just absolutely essential. I try to get myself 9 hours a night if I can. That's a little bit indulgent. But what I know is that if I get that sleep, I wake up feeling great. I'm ready to tackle the day. And I like to believe, even though I've lost a few hours maybe to some of my peers, the hours that I have, they're not just happier, but they're ultimately more productive as well too. So for me, this is a resource I did not draw upon when I was younger. It's a resource that in some respects I know in those moments of my life when I've not been my best self, it's in part because I'm a bit sleep deprived. And it's something today, especially growing a little bit older, I'm no longer close to being in my 20s anymore. The older I get, the more I need that sleep. And to me, it's that indispensable tool I've had to bring out again that best self and that best performance.
There was a study that proved that if you are underslept, or I think if you are wakeful for a certain number of hours, the way you lose cognitive ability is similar to drinking wine. It's positively correlated with drinking. Now, nobody's going to stop you like a policeman on the street and like when you're driving and say, "How many hours did you sleep last night? Oh, let me get your license," right? Nobody's going to do that. But science shows that it is actually really bad, not for only for your health and your mood, but also for your productivity. So those of you who are listening, if you are sacrificing sleep because you want to make it and you have a, if you do it once, that's fine. But if that's a consistent happening, hopefully we can inspire you to take a step back and start paying better attention to your sleep. So thank you so much once again, John Paul. Final question: where could people get in touch with you, find you, reach out, find more about your courses and so on? Where could people find you?
Well, probably the two obvious places are I am on Twitter, and so you can find me at JP Rollert, but also on my faculty page for the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. There's relevant information there, and I'm always delighted to hear from people and connect with people. Leadership, like for you, Stoyan, it's a passion of mine, something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and so I'm always delighted for conversations around it, which is why I've been delighted to be with you here today. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being with us and for the thorough preparation, for all the insights and inspiration. I'm definitely going to re listen to this episode tomorrow during my flight to Graz. So I'm really, really grateful. Thank you so much for being with us. And I want to say thank you for everyone who's been listening to the episode until the end. Episode 101. sorry, 111, which means there's 110 more episodes out there. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to share it with a friend. Make sure to also go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, subscribe to Productivity Mastery, send us a message, post a comment, let us know what you think about it, and keep performing. Look forward to seeing you again at the next episode of Productivity Mastery.